Okay, so I'm Ramon Tayag. I work at Logica, and I'm going to give a talk about multi-tenancy in Postgres, PostgreSQL. I'm a fan of like what people call just-in-time learning. So, you know, I'm not gonna go very in depth here. I'm not gonna necessarily show code. I'm not saying that. But I guess my objective is that you guys know what resources to look at when you come across requirements like I have. So, what did I need to build? Okay, I needed to build a web app that looked different to different people. Fine.
It looked the same.
So, depending on who visited the web app, it looked pretty much completely different. It might function the same way, but it looked different. And my second requirement is that I wanted to be able to copy what you call a user or a tenant and like add more, right? So if there's already an existing one, I'm gonna make a complete duplicate of that and add it to the database. So I was looking at different solutions, and there's this Microsoft paper actually that talks about the three distinct ways that you can go about doing this. And the first one is a shared database and a shared namespace. So that's one database you're connecting to, and all your information, for example, for the pages table, for all your users, they're all in the pages table. This is something that most of you probably have already done. Where when you select, for example, pages for a specific user, you say, find the pages where the user ID is 50. Right? This is the easiest to set up, and this is what Rails and Active Record is actually geared towards. Okay. Next is the third way, actually. This is the third way. And it's at the opposite end of the spectrum where you have separate databases. Your one application will connect to different databases depending on the user. And this is nice for, well, I guess if your users have a lot of data, maybe the database experts can tell me that. That way, you can put, for example, one user's database in a separate computer, right? So if you have 50 users, there may be on 50 different computers, and your application connects to the right computer depending on the user whose information you want to get. This is not good for apps where you share a lot of information, let's say like a social network, since you all love that example. Because if you're gonna see, let's say, another user's posts on your wall, you're gonna have to connect to two separate. Yeah, and it's not. I can't imagine it's gonna be very easy. This is typically for apps where it looks different depending on what user you're visiting. Now the third way is a shared database and a shared and separate namespace. Okay, so namespace, it's like you're gonna set a mode on the database saying, just give me the information under this namespace. So when you do selects, when you look for things in the database, it just returns to you the information for that specific user. This is a marriage between the two because your data actually it looks like to your app, it looks like it almost looks like it lives in a separate database. but it's just one. And the thing is, not all databases have this, like, or at least relational databases. Like MySQL doesn't have the ability to do this. Postgres is one, and I think Oracle. I don't know. I've never. Yeah. Okay. And this is going to be what the talk is about. Actually, this one, this key. So, any questions so far before I continue? Okay. So Postgres has this thing called schemas, all right? But for this talk, I want to call them namespaces because we all know schemas to be something else, which is the structure of your database, right? So I'll just say namespace here. That makes more sense. And in fact, I think Ramon gave a talk, and I think he also repeated the talk for a Ruby meetup here, a local one. On Postgres and multi-tenancy. So, yeah, it's not like I invented this. So, when I was doing my research, I watched this. I watched a bunch of other things, and I guess the problem was before you had to do a lot of this from scratch. He showed you some code that you could use for your Ruby apps, but you still have to figure out a lot of things for yourself. But before I continue, I want to just visualize how this looks. So let's say you have an app that connects to one database. And you have a user. He's a paying user, right? And his name is Karding. And he wants to visit his app. So he goes to karding.app.com and to the first product. And your app can tell what domain the user has used to go to it, right? So if you take the subdomain, for example, you can set in Postgres this thing called the search path. So that's just setting what your schema is. It's like what environment you want to search your data in. And let's say that's this yellow part. And if you say select star from products where ID is 1, it will just select the product with ID of number 1 in the Karding namespace. What about common tables? Let's say it's time for me to bill Karding, right? He owes me $100. It doesn't make sense that you have like an invoices table per user and then you loop through each one, and then you can have tables that don't live, or at least whose data does not live on each separate schema. And that data stays in the public schema. In fact, for those that use Postgres, you already use the public schema. It's like the first schema. It's a default schema. When you start a Postgres and you start writing things into it, it all writes into the public schema. And it stays that way unless you change the search path. So if you are, let's say, you set the search path to Karding and then you say select star from public.invoices, it's like you're saying, I don't care what schema I'm in or what namespace I'm in. I want to search the public invoices table. So in your, for example, in your active record model, you could say set table name to public.invoices. And it'll always look in the public schema. So there is, like I said a while ago before when I first started this, Gainor had like this nice little module you could use, but there are a lot of things that I guess maybe part of it is like I didn't really understand. I didn't understand how schemas worked. And maybe 2 years later, this guy and his team, they released this gem called Apartment. Now this does single database, separate namespace. So that's like what I just described, and the separate database. So it has like adapters for for each kind. You just, when you set it up, you say, I want to use this, you know, I want to use the separate database way. And because of that, it also supports actually MySQL. Now, I tried using this. For the most part, it worked okay. But a lot of the tests were failing on Ubuntu, and I was trying to add patches. I was having a hard time because I had to worry about supporting also the multi-database setup. So, to also understand better, I came up with my own. And if you remember my second requirement, right, which Apartment didn't solve for me, was that I wanted to be able to copy schemas. And what's nice of namespaces, sorry. And what's nice about namespaces is that you can dump a specific namespace to a SQL file. So a user, if you want to give them the ability to do so, can back up their data. Now imagine doing this if you had a single database. You're gonna have to do that, you know, I'm sure you can, I'm sure it's possible, but it sounds really hard. Like, you have to select just what the user has and you have to dump them into some YAML file or something like that. But with Postgres, you can dump a specific schema and put them into different files. So my requirement was to copy a namespace, right? So let's take Carding. I want to dump Carding and duplicate Carding and make it a different user. Okay, so
Want to dump Carding?
that's right.
No one dumps Carding.
And let's say that new user is called Asimo. So what you can do then is load Asimo as a different namespace. Now there were some technical challenges with Postgres. It doesn't support this natively. I had to go as far as like dumping a SQL file for the namespace and then manually changing the entries inside. So I don't think it's necessarily a good way to do to go about it if you have millions and millions of rows. It might take a while. But for my purposes, it works. And then, so I came up with this thing where you can, yeah, I actually named it pretty much the same. A lot of the code looks similar to Apartment. I told the guy actually that, you know, I was able to get the specs passing. It works on Ubuntu and it looks similar. So take a look at it. And this is able to duplicate schemas. And an example of that is, let's say you have a CMS where there are already sample sites, right? And you want your users to pick and say, I like this site. And then it just makes a copy and has all the sample pages that they can edit, but they own it. It's completely separate from the template, quote unquote. Questions so far before I go to the gotchas?
What are you working on?
CMS. Yeah, but you know, this you could use this for things like Basecamp. I think Basecamp uses the single database shared namespace. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So, problem with testing. Yes, transactions do not play well with schemas. You know, your tests are fast because, for the most part, because of, well, fast-ish because of transactions, right? You can, the database can just like roll back and then forget all the changes you did from a certain point onward. But if like in the middle of your test, you're creating a schema, then you switch and then you try to roll back, like, honestly, I don't know what happens. It just screws things up. Like, suddenly your tests fail and you don't know why. So the answer is, at least in tests, you can treat the public schema as its own tenant. So when you want to run integration tests, for most, maybe 99% of your tests, when you're not testing visiting a subdomain, for example, you can just test everything in the public schemas. It's like you're testing a normal CMS instead of one that has multiple tenants. Another one, migrations. Every namespace has its own schema. What's that? Schema migrations table. It keeps track of those long strings of numbers that Rails decides, or that Rails uses to keep track of what migrations you've run. So if you do a rig db migrate, it actually only does it on your public schema, and then suddenly your users can't, the databases of your other users don't look the same. So these two libraries, they come with a special migration, a rake task that basically loops through every user and runs the migration for all of them. Another one that I could see, background jobs. How do the workers know what schema the data's in? You will need to figure out a way to send what schema to find the information in, so the worker can switch namespaces and find the right data. Questions?
For yung CMS.
Huh?
For yung CMS.
No. I don't have the invoices table for nothing.
Or credit cards.
Awesome. I think the problem with a test failing, kasi what I noticed with this, kasi it's not thread safe. And I think right before the next test run, your set schema command doesn't actually take in effect yet, in a way. Controllers or web requests, I think that's fine. Kasi it's single-threaded. Security only runs on that process all the way until the server goes back to you. So you're stuck with that.
But our tests run in, like, when you run a suite of tests, are there multiple?
There's only one connection if I remember, especially if you're using one. You don't have connection pooling it. I think that's the problem. You only use one connection. So right before the next method or the next spec runs, it doesn't change yet. Something like that.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. At least the problem I ran into was the transaction problem. Because it doesn't, like, what do you roll back? Like, what if you wrote something in the public and then you switch namespace and you write something else and you roll back? What namespace are you in? Right? And does it delete even the, well, it didn't actually. It didn't delete the stuff in public. So if at least for most of your tests, you don't switch and you treat like the public as maybe the www user, then it looks like a normal app.
That's an easy solution, don't test.
Yeah.
Actually, I think the context still applies where, even if it's web. The only reason that thing works kasi is single process and Rails.
Wait, if you're saying, well, because if you have multiple connections, they can have different schemas.
Yeah,
or different namespaces.
Yeah.
And so they can just switch whatever.
One connection, one request. That's why this whole thing works. But if you run this, like, let's say with Node, set schema,
I think it'll still work. Because you're not riding on like one connection. If you're, I don't know. Like, does it make multiple database connections?
I'm not sure kasi when it calls back kasi, I mean, there's a chance that the connection is different. I don't know.
Okay, I don't know. But I do know that at least per connection to the database, you can set the schema.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you have like two processes or two things in Node using one database connection. That sounds, I have a feeling if that happens, then it's going to do it already it's gonna go through a bottle.
It has to be able to serialize.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
An active record provide a way of isolating, setting yung isolation level ng transactions. So it's a database. You could do that in a
What do you mean by isolation level?
for instance, change the transaction behavior, which is creating a record. You're changing the schema, which is more. You could set it to block the record.
I'm not sure. Maybe someone else can.
Play around with these settings. You have a table that's being read most of the time.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry. Anything else? Any other questions? Well, if you guys have any more, feel free to approach me after our ding stop.